I'm 72 years old, and I still iron the tablecloth before every holiday meal. Old habits like old loyalties are hard to press out. The silver-threaded linen spread across my dining table tonight once belonged to my grandmother. The pattern shimmered faintly under candlelight, each fold perfectly aligned. The table looked flawless, almost too flawless. My name is Leona Halberg, and for most of my life I've been the kind of woman who fixed things before anyone noticed they were broken. I ran a small handmade soap company here in Asheville, Halberg Soaps, until a national brand bought it for more money than I'd ever imagined earning. That sale paid for college tuition, a new house for my daughter, and the kind of vacations families post online to prove they're happy. I never asked for thanks. Love, I thought, was proof enough. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, familiar as memory itself. I placed the last wine glass beside an heirloom plate and turned toward the empty chair at the head of the table, Paul's chair. He's been gone 11 years, and still I can't set the table without seeing him there, carving the turkey with a wink at me like we shared a secret joke. I blinked hard and straightened the silverware, as if that small act could steady me. The clock on the mantel chimed 6. The first guests would arrive soon. Ariel, my only child, her husband, Nathan, their twins, and a few cousins, who still pretended we were a close family. I wiped my palms on my apron and checked my phone. A single text from Ariel had come an hour ago. "We're on our way. Don't fuss too much this year, okay?" A simple message, polite, even affectionate on the surface, but the words felt cold, like they'd been edited twice before sending. I read it again, slower this time, until the silence of the house seemed to hum with something unnamed. I poured myself a small glass of wine and looked around at what I'd built. The crystal glasses caught the glow from the candles, scattering light across the walls lined with family photographs. Ariel at her wedding smiling in Paul's arms. The twins as toddlers smeared with icing at their first birthday. I'd been there for every milestone, checkbook in hand, heart wide open. Outside headlights cut across the frosted driveway. I heard the quick slam of a car door, laughter, then a pause, the kind that falls when people straighten their expressions before entering. I took one more breath, smoothing my apron and pushing a stray strand of gray hair behind my ear. "All right," I whispered to no one. "Let's make it a good one this year." The doorbell rang sharp and bright against the hush of the house. I set down my glass and moved toward the foyer, ready to welcome them with a smile I wasn't entirely sure I still meant. And as I reached for the handle, the candles on the table flickered just once, as if the air itself sensed something coming. Ariel's voice came first, soft and practiced. "Mom, we're here." I stepped into the foyer, and there she was, 45, polished and brisk, her hair pulled into a sleek twist that looked like it had been styled for an interview, not dinner with family. She held a pumpkin pie in both hands, the kind that came in a cardboard box from the supermarket bakery. "I hope this turned out okay," she said, forcing a cheerful tone. "I tried that new recipe you mentioned." The logo, peeking from the corner of the box, betrayed the lie, but I only smiled. "It looks wonderful, sweetheart." Behind her, Nathan carried a bottle of wine under one arm, scrolling through his phone with the other. "Cabernet 2015, he announced without looking up. "I read it pairs well with turkey, though I'm more of a bourbon man myself." His voice had the same distant warmth as his text messages, a tone designed to sound engaged while giving nothing away. The twins followed Eli and Grace, both 17, both taller than I remembered. Grace offered a half-hearted hug that smelled faintly of expensive shampoo. Eli muttered, "Hey, Grandma," without removing his earbuds. They sank into the couch as soon as they entered, faces glowing in the pale blue light of their screens. I reached for their coats and hung them neatly by the door. The act felt ceremonial, as though each garment marked a version of closeness that no longer fit. "Everything smells amazing," Ariel said, glancing toward the dining room. "You really didn't have to do all this, Mom." We talked about keeping things simple this year. I poured her a glass of wine. I've been keeping things simple all my life, I said gently. Cooking doesn't complicate it, it keeps me grounded. Nathan chuckled, eyes still on his phone. Grounded, that's one word for it. Then, as if realizing how that sounded, he added, I just mean, you never slow down, Leona. It's admirable. He said admirable the way someone might say quaint. Ariel wandered around the living room, straightening the framed photographs I'd already aligned perfectly. You know, she said lightly, Nathan and I have been talking about maybe downsizing next year. The kids will be off to college soon, and it just feels… Time. That sounds practical, I said, though I imagine the house still feels new. It's been 8 years, she reminded me, smiling tightly, and I'm ready for something that feels more ours. Her words lingered longer than they should have. The house had been a wedding gift from me, paid for outright when Nathan's business stumbled. I didn't mention that. Gratitude had a shelf life in this family, and I'd learned not to check the expiration date. Nathan finally pocketed his phone and stepped closer. We've also been talking about setting healthier boundaries, he said, adjusting his cufflink like the thought was casual. Just making sure everyone's roles are clear, you know. Ariel shot him a small, warning glance, then smiled at me as if smoothing over a wrinkle. He means we're trying to be more intentional about family decisions. Nothing dramatic. I nodded slowly, the air shifting ever so slightly around us. Boundaries can be a good thing, I said. They keep people from tripping over one another. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the twins had looked up from their screens, sensing the odd stillness in the room. Then Grace asked when dinner would be ready, and the moment dissolved into clinking glasses and small talk about college applications. As I returned to the kitchen, I could still feel the echo of that word boundaries, trailing me like a draft through a closed door. The house was full of voices again, but it had never sounded so far away. The kitchen was always my refuge, but that night it felt like a stage. I moved between the stove and the counter with the quiet rhythm of someone who's done this dance for decades. Butter melting in the pan, rosemary crushed between my palms, the scent of roasted garlic thick in the air. Paul's old recipe card rested beside me, stained with years of use. Sweet potato casserole, 2 cups brown sugar, crushed pecans on top. He used to hum while we cooked, stirring the batter like a man conducting an orchestra. I still heard him sometimes in the soft scrape of a wooden spoon. Ariel leaned against the doorway, watching as if inspecting an exhibit. Mom, you still use that much butter? She asked, half laughing, half cringing. It's just a lot. You know, everyone's trying to eat cleaner now. It's Christmas, I said. We can be clean tomorrow, she gave a faint smile. You always say that. Nathan appeared behind her, sipping wine. I read something about olive oil being a better fat. Maybe we should update the family recipes. I nodded politely, though I kept stirring the butter until it hissed. Ariel lifted the casserole spoon and dipped a taste onto her tongue. It's good, she said, just rich, heavy. People don't eat like this anymore. I felt the words more than heard them, each one landing where pride and love overlap. She meant well, or wanted to, but it was the tone that hurt. That slight superiority she wore like perfume. Your father liked it this way, I said, quieter now. Said it reminded him of home. She didn't answer, just wiped the spoon with a paper towel and set it aside like it needed cleaning. For a moment, we worked in silence, she adjusting the serving platters. Me trying not to remember the last time she'd been in this kitchen. That was 3 years ago after her boutique closed. The memory rose whether I wanted it or not. Ariel sitting at this same table, eyes red bills spread out like confession papers. It was just bad timing, she'd said. We had investors lined up. I'd written a check that day enough to pay her debts, and more, and told her it didn't have to be a failure. But something in her face had broken anyway. Maybe she heard pity in my voice. Maybe she was right. Now, as she rearranged the salt and pepper shakers for no reason, I wondered if that moment had drawn a line between us neither of us ever crossed again. "I'm just trying to help Mom," she said, her tone softening. I know I said, though. The air between us said otherwise. I pulled the casserole from the oven, steam curling toward the ceiling. The smell of sugar and butter filled the room, familiar and safe. Yet somehow it no longer belonged to us. Ariel smiled faintly, a hostess smile, polished and polite. "Maybe next year we can try something lighter," she said. I placed the dish on the counter beside the pie she hadn't baked and nodded. "Maybe." The word lingered like smoke. By the time the turkey came out of the oven, the house had filled with that particular kind of noise that only families make. Plates clinking, someone laughing too loud, the faint hum of overlapping conversations. For a while, I let myself believe it was real. I basted the turkey one last time and listened to the murmur of voices from the living room. Nathan's baritone carried easily confident and unguarded. "Yeah, Tuscany in June," he was saying. "We finally booked it. Villa near Siena, just us and the kids. Can't wait to unplug for a bit." There was a pause, then a man's voice on speaker, his brother, I realized. Nathan laughed. "No, not a big group thing. Just immediate family this time. We need space to recharge." The wooden spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the counter. I froze, staring at the gravy shimmering on the stove. Just immediate family. The words were plain harmless, even, but they struck like cold water. I'd heard them before. Different phrasing, same meaning. When Ariel turned 12 and decided she was too old to hold my hand. When she got married and asked me to let the planner handle it. When she opened her boutique and told me I didn't understand her generation's market. But this was different. This was erasure dressed as logistics. I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, my breath slow and deliberate. I knew that travel account Nathan liked to brag about the one that gave them airline miles and concierge perks. It had started from the same fund I'd set up after selling Hallberg soaps. I hadn't meant it as control, only safety. A cushion for the life Paul and I had wanted her to have. From the next room, I heard Ariel's voice, light and sure. "It'll be good for the kids. They need to see more of the world." "Totally," Nathan agreed. "And it's time we did something just for us." The tone wasn't cruel. That made it worse. I stirred the gravy, though it didn't need stirring, and steadied my hand. The air smelled of rosemary and butter, too rich now, too heavy. I wanted to walk into the living room and ask who they thought paid for their world in the first place, but I didn't. Pride can be a quiet, dangerous thing. Mine told me to smile through it, to keep the peace, to serve dinner on time. When I finally carried the platter out, Ariel looked up, beaming. "Oh, Mom, that looks perfect," she said, as if nothing in the world had shifted. I smiled back. My voice sounded steady when I said, "Let's eat while it's hot." The table glowed with candles, faces bright and expectant, but my seat felt colder than it ever had before. Somewhere between the laughter and the passing of the rolls, something small inside me loosened a thread I hadn't realized was holding so much together. The table gleamed under candlelight, each flame mirrored in the polished silver like small trembling stars. The smell of roasted turkey, nutmeg, and wine filled the air. Music played softly from an old speaker in the corner. Instrumental jazz, the kind Paul always said made a house feel civilized. For a moment, it almost did. Ariel arranged the wine glasses into a neater line, though they were already perfect. "Everything looks beautiful, Mom," she said too brightly. "You really outdid yourself again." I smiled. "That's what holidays are for." Nathan poured wine for everyone, his movements smooth and deliberate. He always looked like a man rehearsing charm for an audience. "You'd think after all these years she'd get tired of setting the bar this high," he said, raising his glass toward me. "Leona, here's to another flawless feast." The cousins clinked glasses. The twins barely looked up from their phones. For an instant, I thought about saying something light, something easy. But instead, I looked at Paul's empty chair and felt the weight of every Christmas that had passed since he'd left it vacant. Before we eat, I said I'd like to say grace. The chatter quieted. Even the jazz seemed to hush itself. Everyone reached for a hand. Ariel took mine cool and slightly damp. I bowed my head. Thank you, I began, for the food before us, the hands that prepared it, and the family that still finds its way home. Thank you for second chances, even when they come late or quietly. And thank you for what remains when everything else changes. When I lifted my head, a stillness hung over the table that didn't feel like reverence. Ariel's eyes flickered to Nathan, then down to her plate. The twins exchanged a look I couldn't read. Nathan cleared his throat. Amen, he said a beat too late. Beautiful words, Leona. Always so heartfelt. His tone tried for sincerity, but landed somewhere else. Dinner began. Plates passed, forks clinked. Laughter rose in careful bursts. I watched them all, my daughter, my grandchildren, the man she'd chosen. Their faces lit by firelight looked almost unfamiliar, as though I'd invited strangers wearing masks of people I used to know. Ariel talked about the twins' college plans, her voice warm and rehearsed. Eli's thinking of business school, and Grace wants design. We'll see which one actually follows through. She smiled, but didn't meet my eyes. That's wonderful, I said. I started saving for their tuition the year they were born. Nathan chuckled, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. You really think ahead, Leona. We might need you to manage our budget next. Careful, one of the cousins teased. She'll have you on a spreadsheet before dessert. The laughter came easy for them, but I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, just distance. When I reached to refill Ariel's glass, she covered it quickly. I'm good, she said, trying to pace myself tonight. Of course, I replied, setting the bottle down. Her hand lingered on her glass a second longer than necessary, a small tremor running through her fingers. Then she glanced toward Nathan again, an exchange so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking. Something passed between them. Not affection, not tension, exactly, something colder, organized. The faint coordination of two people who had agreed on a plan. Conversation carried on around me, light as snow falling on a frozen lake. I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, but inside, the edges of the night had already begun to shift. As I carved the first slice of turkey, the knife pressed against the grain with a soft, deliberate sound. Every detail, the silver, the candles, the laughter felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something none of us wanted to name. Dessert was always the easiest part of Christmas sweetness after the ceremony, the part where everyone relaxed, where the stories and wine usually softened the edges of the day. This year, though, even the whipped cream looked uneasy. Ariel carried the pie to the table, the store-bought crust already crumbling at the edges. She served neat slices, careful, deliberate, her movements a little too precise. Nathan poured more wine for himself, none for me, and leaned back in his chair as if he were hosting, not a guest in the house I'd built. I tried to focus on the ordinary. Grace was telling a story about her art class. Eli interrupted with a joke about his teacher. Their laughter was light and real. For one fragile moment, it felt like family again. Then Ariel rose from her chair. She held her glass with both hands, her smile tight, her eyes bright in a way that wasn't joy. Before we finished dessert, she said, her voice carrying easily through the room, "There's something we need to talk about as a family." The room quieted. Even the twins stopped laughing. Nathan shifted forward, elbows on the table, the picture of support. Ariel glanced at him, then at me. "Mom," she began, "we've been talking, Nathan and I, and some of the family, and we've made a decision." My fork paused mid-air. "A decision?" Her throat moved as she swallowed. "Yes, we voted." The word hung there absurd and heavy. Around the table, a few cousins nodded, unsure where to look. Ariel pressed on her tone, rehearsed but trembling at the edges. You've always done so much for everyone, and we love you for it. But we feel it's time for you to step back from making family decisions, from managing things, from the house, too. The room didn't move. Nathan cleared his throat. What Ariel means, he said smoothly, is that we've noticed some patterns, decisions being made without discussion. The way finances get handled, or who gets help, and when. It's a lot for one person to control. I looked from him to her. Ariel's face stayed polite, but her hands were trembling. Control, I repeated. He nodded. We're worried about your judgment, Leona. You've been generous, no one's denying that, but sometimes generosity becomes a way of keeping people dependent. We want everyone to have a voice now. The cousins murmured approval, relieved to be included in something that wasn't their mess. The twins looked from their mother to me, wide-eyed and silent. My heartbeat roared in my ears. The candlelight blurred. Ariel smiled thinly, as if to soften the blow. We're not shutting you out, Mom. We just think it's healthier if you step aside and let us make our own choices. You've done enough. You deserve to rest. Rest. The word struck harder than any accusation. I stared at the table, the plates I'd polished, the food I'd cooked, the home that still smelled like Paul's cologne in winter. Nathan leaned back again, satisfied. You've worked hard your whole life. We're just trying to make sure no one gets overwhelmed. It's time for a transition. I wanted to speak, to ask what exactly they thought I'd done wrong, but my mouth wouldn't form the words. My hands rested on the linen like they belonged to someone else. Across the table, Grace whispered something to Eli, who frowned and looked down at his plate. He knew. Children always do. Ariel reached for my hand, her fingers cold. Mom, please don't take this the wrong way. We love you. We just need space. I nodded, because nodding was easier than speaking. Around us, the others began to talk again, careful, hushed, filling the silence with the sound of forks scraping china. The candles burned lower, the wax pooling like spilled gold, and I realized I could hear my own pulse louder than any voice in the room. Somewhere deep inside, something quiet cracked. I didn't say a word. I just looked at the faces of my family, each one turned slightly away, and felt the room tilt, as though the foundation beneath us had shifted one vote at a time. I don't remember standing up. One moment I was sitting at the head of the table, my fork resting beside a half-eaten piece of pie, and the next I was on my feet, my chair sliding back across the hardwood. No one spoke. Maybe they thought I was going to cry. Maybe they hoped I would. Instead, I straightened my napkin, laid it neatly beside my plate, and said quietly, "If you're done voting, I'd like to share something of my own." Ariel blinked, her confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "Mom, we didn't mean I know what you meant," I said, my voice steady. "Please excuse me a moment." I walked down the hall to my study, the soft click of my shoes on the floorboards, the only sound in the house. The scent of pine and cinnamon followed me, too sweet, now cloying. The room was dim, lit only by the lamp on Paul's old desk. He'd built the drawers himself, smooth oak, with brass handles that still gleamed. I pulled open the top one and lifted out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a gold clasp. It wasn't impulsive. I'd prepared it weeks ago, though I couldn't have said why. Then only that some part of me had begun to mistrust the warmth in my daughter's voice when she called the politeness that always came before another request. I'd written down every number, every transfer, every loan forgiven. Old habits of an accountant's wife die hard. When I returned to the dining room, every head turned toward me. The chatter had stopped entirely. I set the envelope down beside the pie dish and said, "You mentioned transition, Ariel. I think it's time." Nathan frowned. "What is that?" "Your inheritance," I said. Ariel laughed lightly, though no one else joined her. Mom, that's not, I held up a hand. You've made it clear I should step back from decisions and the house. I understand. But before I do, I thought you should see exactly what you're stepping away from. She hesitated, then reached for the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. She slid out the contents, a stack of printed pages, neatly stapled, each line an entry. At the top, the heading read, Summary of Family Support, 2002-2023. Her lips moved as she scanned the list. Tuition mortgage, down payment business, capital medical bills, summer camp trust contributions. Her voice faltered. Nathan leaned closer. What is this documentation, I said, of every gift and expense I've covered in the last 20 years? You always said I keep too many records. You were right. He flipped through the pages, his face reddening. This can't be right. Oh, it's accurate, I said. I double-checked. The total is at the bottom of the last page. Ariel turned it over, eyes widening as she read the number aloud. 4,830,000. Her voice broke on the last word. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the dimmer light. I looked around at them. My daughter, her husband, my grandchildren, the cousins who had nodded along and felt something solid settle inside me. These weren't loans, I said softly. They were gifts, out of love. But love and funding aren't the same thing. Tonight I'm ending both as an obligation. Nathan pushed the papers back across the table. You're punishing us. No, I said, I'm taking your vote seriously. No one moved. Even the twins sat still, their faces pale and uncertain. I gathered my empty plate, the fork, the napkin, and carried them to the sink. The sound of running water filled the silence like static. When I turned back, they were all still staring at the envelope, as if it were something dangerous that might explode if touched again. I wiped my hands on a towel and smiled faintly. Dessert's over, I said. You can take the papers with you when you leave. Then I blew out the candles one by one until only the dim light from the hallway remained soft and merciless. The sound of paper sliding across linen was louder than it should have been. Ariel's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the first page. Nathan leaned closer, his hand on the back of her chair, his face unreadable. I stood near the table, not sitting, my hand resting on the back of Paul's empty chair. The room smelled faintly of wine and melted wax, the sweetness of dessert already gone. Ariel's eyes moved down the list, her lips parting as she read. Tuition payments. Eli and Grace St. Edmund's Academy, $36,000 a year, she murmured. Her voice wavered. Mortgage supplements. Rivercrest property, $400 monthly transfer for 82 months. Startup investment boutique capital, $145,000. Nathan's business reinvestment, $310,000. Health coverage insurance shortfall. Down payment on second car. Her words slowed until they barely formed sound. She turned the page. Another list followed, each entry precise, printed in black ink, the way Paul used to keep our ledgers when Halberg Soaps was still a small workshop in our garage. At the far edge of the table, one of the cousins cleared his throat, then fell silent again. Ariel read the handwritten note at the bottom of the page aloud. To help Ariel start fresh, she said, almost whispering, the next page. To cover Nathan's losses. The one after that, for the twins' future so they never feel small. Each phrase was my voice from years ago, recorded in careful penmanship I barely recognized now. She reached the final page and stared at the total. 4,830,000, she said, the number landing heavy between us. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. Nathan finally spoke, his tone clipped. You've been keeping track all this time. I've always kept records, I said. It's how I made a living and how I kept a family afloat. Ariel set the papers down, her hands still trembling. Mom, this feels like an invoice. It isn't, I said. I'm not asking for repayment. Those were gifts. Every cent was given freely. Then why show us? She asked, voice cracking. Why tonight? Because gifts stop meaning anything when they become expected. Because I wanted you to see what love looked like in numbers. And because all gifts end tonight. Her breath caught. Nathan leaned forward. You can't just stop. I can, I said quietly. And I will. He laughed under his breath, a small, disbelieving sound. You're serious? I'm tired, I said simply. Not angry, not vindictive, just tired of paying for a seat at a table I already own. No one moved. Even the twins had put their phones down. Grace stared at me, eyes wide and wet, Eli's face frozen somewhere between confusion and shame. Ariel picked up one of the pages again, looking at the tidy columns as if the ink itself accused her. We didn't mean I know, I interrupted gently. You meant to take care of yourselves. You just forgot who taught you how. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Nathan pressed his palm flat against the table, his ring tapping the surface once. So what now? He asked. Now I said you build your own foundation. You wanted independence. It's yours. Ariel folded the pages carefully, aligning the corners the way I used to do with her schoolwork when she was small. Her voice was thin when she spoke. You kept everything. I nodded. I keep what matters. The clock in the hallway chimed, once the sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. The air felt different afterward, lighter for me, heavier for everyone else. No one spoke again. I gathered the remaining napkins and stacked the plates, the ordinary motions of a hostess ending her evening. Behind me, I heard Ariel exhale long and quiet, as if she'd finally realized that love, when written down, could look an awful lot like accountability. For a long moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. The papers lay spread across the table like evidence after a trial. No one reached for them now. Ariel broke the silence first. Mom, she said softly, we didn't mean for this to become— It already has, I interrupted. My voice was calm, even measured. You wanted space, Ariel. I understand that. But space is a two-way street. Nathan straightened his chair, scraping against the floor. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying I'll make this easier for everyone, I said. Starting tonight, I'm stepping back from all financial involvement. His brow furrowed. What does that even mean? It means, I replied, folding my hands on the table, that the twins' tuition payments stop as of January 5th. The school will send invoices directly to you. My trust's automatic transfers, those that go to your accounts on the first of each month, are canceled. The mortgage on your house renews in March. My co-signature will not be part of the renewal. And Nathan Halberg Supply will end its partnership with your firm at the close of the current contract cycle. The words came out quietly, but each one seemed to strike the air like glass cracking. Nathan stared at me, mouth tightening. That's completely unreasonable. You can't just cut everything off like that. Your family. I met his eyes. You said yourself family shouldn't manipulate with money. I'm agreeing with you. Ariel's face had gone pale. Mom, please, she whispered. The kids' tuition, it's due in a week. They'll be expelled. They won't, I said. They'll just need to attend public school for a semester. Many children do. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. This isn't you. You don't make decisions like this. I almost smiled. Apparently I do. You voted me out of family decisions. I'm simply honoring it. Across the table, one of the cousins whispered something to another, and the room filled with that uneasy shuffle people make when they want to disappear. Nathan stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. You're punishing us because we wanted independence. That's not grace, that's cruelty. I shook my head. No, Nathan, this is grace. It's giving you the freedom you asked for." He laughed once sharp and humorless. "You think we can just replace that kind of support overnight? You've tied everything together for years. Pull one string and it all unravels." "Then maybe it was time it unraveled," I said. "Anything held together only by money isn't family. It's dependency." Ariel reached across the table, fingers trembling. "Mom, please think about the kids. Think about what this does to them." I said. "That's exactly why I'm doing it now. They need to see their parents stand on their own." She looked down, shoulders shaking. Nathan turned away, jaw tight, running his hands through his hair. I rose and gathered the papers into a neat stack, sliding them back into the envelope. "You said you wanted a change. I'm giving it to you. Starting tomorrow, you handle your own accounts, your own future. You've earned it." When I turned to leave, Ariel's voice cracked behind me. "You're walking away." I paused at the doorway. "No, I'm stepping back. There's a difference." Nathan muttered something under his breath, but I didn't ask what. The cousins stood awkwardly, offering half-hearted goodbyes. Even the twins were silent, their confusion filling the space their parents' pride had left behind. In the kitchen, I blew out the last of the candles one by one until only the faint smell of smoke remained. Behind me, the voices in the dining room had begun again, low, urgent, panicked. I set the envelope on the counter, the gold clasp catching the light. For years, I had paid for harmony thinking it was love. Tonight, I discovered the price of peace was finally mine to decide. By the time the last car left the driveway, the house had gone still. No laughter, no overlapping voices, no sound except the faint tick of the mantel clock. The table was a battlefield of crumbs and half-empty glasses. A fork lay on the floor beside a napkin someone had stepped on. I stood for a while, not moving, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Then I did what I've always done after every family dinner I cleaned. I gathered the plates, stacking them neatly, scraping away bits of cranberry and bread into the trash. The sink filled with warm, soapy water. The rhythm of washing felt mechanical, almost merciful. If I focused on the dishes, I didn't have to think about the look on Ariel's face, or the way Nathan's voice had gone cold when he realized I meant every word. The window above the sink fogged as the steam rose. Outside, the lawn glistened with frost. The string lights Ariel insisted we hang last week, still twinkling faintly. They looked fragile now, out of place. My hands moved through the water, finding comfort in the simple act of scrubbing, rinsing, drying. Somewhere between the second and third wine glass, a memory surfaced, one I hadn't visited in years. Paul and I, 23 and terrified in the tiny apartment above his uncle's garage. We'd invited his boss to dinner, desperate to make a good impression. We couldn't afford dessert plates then. We'd served pie on mismatched saucers borrowed from a neighbor. Paul had laughed about it all night, saying we didn't need fancy things, just each other. After they left, we'd stood at the same kind of sink washing dishes, shoulder to shoulder, both of us certain life would get easier. And it had, at least for a while. We built the business, bought this house, raised Ariel under its roof. Everything we'd dreamed of came true, except the part where it was supposed to feel safe forever. I rinsed the last plate and set it in the rack. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. Older, steadier, someone I wasn't sure Paul would recognize. The house around me was full of things we'd chosen together. The hutch he built, the framed landscape he loved, the clock that still chimed too loud on the hour. Yet somehow, it didn't feel like ours tonight. I dried my hands on a towel and turned off the kitchen light. The floor creaked underfoot as I moved through the rooms, extinguishing what remained of the evening candles' lamps, the faint glow of the tree in the corner. Each flicker I snuffed out left a small ache in its place. Upstairs, I paused outside the guest rooms, half expecting to hear voices, the familiar murmur of family settling in for the night. But they were gone. Just the echo of footsteps that wouldn't return soon, maybe ever. In my bedroom, the sheets were cool and stiff, the pillows smelling faintly of lavender. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my dress, too tired to change. The silence pressed close, not cruelly, just completely. This was the same house they said they wanted to reclaim, the one they believed needed new energy. I looked around at the walls that had held every stage of our lives and wondered what they'd do if they ever stood here alone like this. Nothing left to prove and no one left to save. When I finally lay back, the darkness felt like water closing over me. The house exhaled softly, settling into its own kind of peace. The Monday after Christmas came gray and damp, a thin drizzle tapping the kitchen windows. I woke earlier than usual, out of habit, more than purpose. For the first time in years, no alerts buzzed from my phone, no transfer reminders, no banking notifications, asking for approval on recurring family payments. The silence was strange, but it didn't hurt. By mid-morning, I found myself sitting across from a young teller at the Asheville branch of First Federal. Her name tag read Megan. She couldn't have been more than 25, cheerful, in the polite way people are when they don't yet know your story. "I just need to confirm the closure of those automatic transfers," I said, sliding a folder across the counter. Everything that was connected to the Halberg Family Fund. She typed for a few seconds, her acrylic nails tapping softly. "Yes, ma'am, I see it here. All 5 recurring transactions canceled as of today." She looked up, hesitating. "Would you like to replace them with anything new? Maybe a personal savings plan or—" "No," I said, smiling gently. "I think I'd like to see what a quiet account feels like for a while." Her smile faltered for half a second, then returned. "That sounds nice," she said. Outside, the air smelled of rain and pine. I walked along the wet sidewalk past the small bakery. Paul and I used to visit on Saturdays. The bell over the door still jingled the same way. I almost went in, but I didn't. Instead, I turned toward the community center at the corner of Maple and 3rd, where a sign on the window read, "Appalachian Women's Co-op. Handcrafts and Renewal." Inside, a handful of women were setting up folding tables for the morning class. Most were younger, some older, all of them busy. A woman with silver curls and a denim apron approached me with a welcoming smile. "You must be Mrs. Halberg. I heard you wanted to volunteer." "Just Leona," I corrected softly. "And yes, I used to make soap, still do sometimes. Thought I could help teach if you need extra hands." Her name was Cora. She showed me the supply shelves and handed me a pair of gloves. Before long, I was explaining how to measure lye safely, how the oils bind, how patience determines the scent. My voice found its rhythm again, the same tone I'd used in boardrooms years ago, except now it didn't feel like authority. It felt like sharing. By noon, the classroom smelled of lavender and eucalyptus. Someone laughed when their batch hardened too fast. Another woman clapped her hands when her mold came out perfectly. Their joy filled the space in a way that wasn't loud, just alive. When the session ended, Cora pressed a mug of tea into my hands. "You've got a knack for teaching," she said. "You coming back next week?" I nodded. "If you'll have me." On the walk home, the drizzle had turned to soft mist. I passed the florist where I used to buy lilies for Ariel's birthday, and the bookstore where the clerk always saved new releases for Paul. The city felt the same but looked different, as though it had widened slightly, now that I wasn't walking within someone else's orbit. At home, I opened my old notebook, the one with Paul's initials embossed on the cover, and began sketching numbers. Not household expenses or trust disbursements, but something smaller, personal. A fund for women who'd left marriages or lost jobs and needed seed money to start again. Nothing extravagant, just enough to give someone a foothold. The pencil moved easily across the page, the columns clean and simple. By evening, I'd already written a name at the top, the Halberg Renewal Fund. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the window where the rain had turned to a slow silver drizzle. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel responsible for anyone else's comfort. The house was still, but not hollow. It breathed with me, quiet, steady, and finally my own. The boxes had been sitting in the living room for a week before Ariel admitted they weren't for decoration. They were plain and heavy, the kind meant for moving, though she still told the twins it was just a little reorganization. Nathan stood by the window, pacing the afternoon light, making the sharp planes of his face look harder. "They won't renew without her co-signature," he said. "I called the bank twice. Without that guarantee, the new rate jumps to 8.2. That's $4,000 a month." "We can't." Ariel taped another box shut, the sound slicing through his words. "Don't," she said. "Please, just don't start again." He turned. "Start. You think this is about starting? I told you this would happen when you pushed her like that." Her hands froze mid-motion. "I didn't push her." We all agreed. "Yeah," he interrupted, his voice rising. "But you're the one who said it. You're the one she looked at when she decided to pull the plug." Upstairs, the twins sat at the top of the stairs listening through the railing. Eli's phone screen glowed faintly, unread messages piling up in silence. Grace pulled her knees to her chest. "Are we moving?" she whispered. He shook his head. "I don't know." In the kitchen, the argument kept unraveling. Nathan paced again, his tone bitter now. "The tuition's due next week. I can't pull that much from the account. You think the school's going to wait for us to figure it out?" Ariel sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. "I'll call them. Maybe we can work something out. I'll tell them it's temporary." He laughed once, short and sharp. "Temporary? We're one paycheck from losing this house." Ariel's voice cracked. "I'll find a way." Nathan stopped pacing. "You always say that." And the way always ends with her writing a check. The silence that followed was louder than shouting. From upstairs, Eli whispered, "They're fighting about Grandma again." Grace didn't answer. She just stared at the boxes and the half-empty bookshelf where the family photos used to sit. That same week, a few miles away, Joaquin Vargas Ariel's cousin and one of the nodding faces at that dinner table sat at his law office, staring at an email that had arrived at dawn. It was short and formal. No apology, no emotion. "Effective immediately, Hellberg Supply Company will seek alternate legal representation for its corporate matters. We thank you for your past service." He leaned back in his chair, muttering under his breath. His partner glanced over from the next desk. "Bad news," Joaquin sighed. Leona pulled the account. The partner whistled low. "That's 20% of our annual billables." He didn't reply. He just clicked the mouse again and reread the email, hoping he'd missed a line that wasn't there. By the end of the month, word had made its way through their circle, the quiet kind of gossip that travels faster than any announcement. At the cafe where the cousins met on Fridays, someone said, "She really did it." Another replied, "I thought she'd calm down." And a third, shaking her head, murmured, "No, she meant it." Even the twins had begun to understand. The things that once seemed invisible. The groceries that refilled themselves, the vacations that appeared like clockwork. The easy life that had always been there had cracks, now, hairline fractures widening each day. At night, Ariel stood in the doorway of her children's room, watching them sleep under the glow of a small lamp. Nathan had stopped coming to bed early. He stayed downstairs, scrolling through financial apps, muttering numbers like prayers. She walked back to the living room, where the mortgage statement sat open on the coffee table. The new amount was printed in bold, impossible black. Her reflection wavered in the glossy paper. For the first time, she saw what her mother must have felt, how giving without limit becomes another kind of prison. The clock ticked past midnight. She picked up the phone, scrolled to her mother's number, and hesitated. Then she set it down again, the screen going dark in her hand. Outside, a wind moved through the trees, scattering the last of the Christmas lights across the porch. the house shuddered softly, its silence brittle and full of consequence. The new year arrived without celebration. I didn't bother taking down the wreath on the door. The pine had dried into a brittle green shedding needles that gathered like tiny memories along the porch. Inside, the house stayed quiet, except for the soft hum of the furnace and the distant ticking of the mantel clock. By the second week of January, my phone began to fill. The first voicemail came on a Monday evening. Ariel's voice was raw, thin at the edges. "Mom, I know you're angry," she said. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. The mortgage is, well, it's worse than we thought. Can we talk? Please." The next day came another shorter message. This time her tone was smaller. "I'll pay you back. Just a little help with tuition until we get caught up. I'll make it right." I didn't respond. I listened once, deleted both, and went back to slicing oranges for the next morning's class at the co-op. By Thursday, the messages multiplied. Nathan's voice joined hers, stiff at first, then cracking. "Leona, I owe you an apology. I was out of line. I said things I shouldn't have, but we're drowning here. The market crashed and the investors pulled out. You know how it goes. I just need a bridge loan, something temporary." I could almost hear the papers rustling in the background, the stress in the way he forced calm into every word. More messages followed, one from a cousin offering to help mediate, another from a family friend who thought I should let bygones be bygones. By the end of the week, I had over 20 voicemails, each one an echo of the same melody. Regret sung too late. On Friday morning, my accountant, Mr. Delaney, called. His voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the discomfort underneath. "Mrs. Halberg, I've received several inquiries," he said. "Your daughter and son-in-law have reached out about arranging, well, payment plans." "Payment plans," I repeated, setting down my cup of tea. "Yes. They're hoping you might reconsider your position on the canceled support, maybe reinstate part of it as a loan structure. They mentioned the school, the mortgage, some outstanding fees." "Tell them no," I said quietly. He hesitated. "No negotiation at all." "No," I said again, this time firmer. "Tell them I'm honoring their vote." He was silent for a moment before clearing his throat. "Understood, ma'am. I'll communicate that politely," I said. "And thank you, Mr. Delaney." After I hung up, I stood by the window for a long while, watching the drizzle fade into snow. The town looked hushed, the sidewalks nearly empty. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A child pulled a sled across the slush. Life went on steady and indifferent. My phone buzzed again. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Instead, I turned it face down on the counter and went back to stirring a batch of lavender soap that needed curing before morning. The scent filled the kitchen, clean, sharp, honest. When the day ended, I sat at my desk with Paul's old ledger open beside me. The inked columns were long closed, the numbers still legible after all these years. Next to them in the margin, he'd written something once almost as a joke. "Fairness is balance, not sacrifice." I traced the words with my thumb. Balance had been missing for so long, I'd forgotten what it looked like. The phone blinked again. A new voicemail. The 20th, maybe the 30th. I turned off the sound and let the blinking light fade on its own. In the silence that followed, I realized the calls no longer hurt. They were just noise trying to fill a space that no longer belonged to them. The storm came in just before dusk, sweeping down from the mountains with a hiss that soaked everything in minutes. Rain streaked the windows in silver lines, blurring the pines beyond the yard. I had just finished my tea and was folding the dish towel when I heard the faint, uneven knock on the front door. It wasn't the mail carrier or a neighbor. I knew that before I even reached the hallway. Something about the rhythm, hesitant, almost apologetic, made my chest tighten. When I opened the door, Ariel stood on the porch drenched. Her coat clung to her shoulders, hair plastered against her face, mascara washed clean away. She looked smaller than I remembered. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice a breath above the rain. For a moment, Neither of us moved. The storm roared behind her, wind lifting the corner of the doormat like a warning. Then I stepped aside. "You'll catch pneumonia out there. Come in." She hesitated, then crossed the threshold as though it might collapse beneath her feet. Water pooled from her shoes onto the hardwood. I took her coat, heavy with rain, and hung it by the door. In the kitchen, the air smelled of honey and lemon from the tea I'd left steeping. I poured her a cup without asking and set it on the table. She wrapped her hands around it, trembling faintly. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, staring into the steam. "Nathan left 2 weeks ago. We sold the house, or what was left of it. The twins are staying with friends until I find somewhere new." I sat across from her, quiet. "I thought it would feel freeing," she continued, a brittle laugh escaping her. "Not relying on anyone. Not being your daughter with the safety net. But it turns out I don't know how to live without one. I used to think your control suffocated me. Now I see it was holding everything together." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her palms to her face. "I understand what I did, Mom. I treated you like an obligation. Like the past was something I had to outgrow. I wanted to be independent, but I confused independence with rejection." The rain softened outside, tapering to a steady rhythm against the roof. I let the silence stretch between us, not cruelly, just honestly. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red swollen. "I'm not asking for money," she said. "I know better now. I just needed you to know I see it. All of it. And I'm sorry." I nodded slowly, the ache in my chest, deep but not sharp. "You don't owe me apologies," I said. "Forgiveness is easy, Ariel. It happens the moment you start telling the truth." She swallowed hard. "Then do you forgive me?" "Yes," I said simply. "But trust, that's something different. Trust takes proof. It takes time." Her eyes filled again, though she managed a fragile smile. "I'll earn it if you'll let me." I reached across the table and touched her hand, the same hand that had once gripped mine, crossing streets, learning to write, tying ribbons in her hair. "One step at a time," I said. She nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet relief. The tea between us had gone cold, but neither of us moved to warm it. When the storm finally eased, I walked her to the door. She stood on the porch, raincoat still damp, the air smelling of wet earth and early spring. "Thank you for letting me in," she whispered. I didn't answer right away. The porch light flickered once in the wind, catching her face worn remorseful, but softer than before. "Drive safe," I said, and closed the door gently, leaving her silhouette framed against the rain. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like exhaling. Outside, early April sunlight streamed through the curtains, turning the air gold and dust soft. I had spent the morning tending to the herb garden behind the porch, lavender, mint, and a few stubborn basil plants pushing through last year's soil. It felt good to touch something that grew without needing permission. When I came back inside, I sat at my desk by the window, the same desk where Paul used to balance our books, where every major decision in our lives had once been inked and signed. The envelope, the cream-colored one, still lay in the drawer, its flap worn from handling. I hadn't opened it since Christmas. This time I took out a single sheet of stationery, smooth and unlined, and began to write. "Dear Ariel, I've thought a lot about that night. Not the vote, not the silence after, but the way you looked at me when you finally spoke truth. It takes more strength to admit a mistake than to hide one, and I saw something brave in you that evening on the porch. Thank you for coming back, even when it must have felt unbearable." The pen paused. Outside, a bird called from the maple tree, high and insistent. I smiled faintly, then continued. "You once said I used money to keep control. You weren't entirely wrong. I see now how often I used generosity as a shield, buying peace instead of speaking truth. I thought I was helping, but sometimes giving is just a quieter way of apologizing for love that feels too big to manage." I set the pen down, letting the ink dry. The words looked calm, almost weightless, though they came from a place that had once ached like bone. If I could wish you one thing, it wouldn't be comfort. Comfort is easy temporary. I'd wish you courage, the kind that lets you start again even when you've lost the safety of being someone's child. You'll find that it's a different kind of freedom, but it's the one worth having. I added nothing more. No closing sentiment, no signature. Just a single line of space beneath the last sentence, open, like a pause between heartbeats. Then I folded the page neatly, once, twice the way I used to fold receipts before filing them away. My hands didn't tremble. I slid the letter into the same envelope I'd once handed across the table, sealing it without tape, without a stamp. It felt complete in its incompleteness. I placed it back into the drawer beside the ledger next to Paul's penknife and a stack of old tax forms that no longer mattered. For a long while I sat there watching sunlight crawl across the floor, touching the brass edges of the cabinet, warming the wood. Maybe one day she'd find the letter. Maybe she never would. It didn't matter. The act of writing it had already done what needed to be done. When the light began to fade, I closed the drawer and stood. The garden outside glowed faintly in the last amber streaks of day. Somewhere beyond the trees, I imagined Ariel finding her footing again, not in the shadow of what she'd lost, but in the strength of what she'd learned to stand without. The letter would remain where it belonged, unmailed, unspoken, but true. By midsummer, the house had taken on a gentler rhythm. The garden thrived under the long, light lavender stretching tall rosemary softening the air, mint spilling past the edges of its planter. The once silent kitchen now carried the sounds of conversation again, not of family disputes, but of laughter that didn't demand anything in return. The evening of the co-op dinner was simple by design. I set out mismatched plates, cloth napkins, and 2 bottles of local wine. The women from my class began arriving, just as the sun dipped behind the hills. Cora, with her silver curls and her easy laugh, Joni, who brought her teenage daughter to help serve, and Mara, the youngest of them all, who'd started her own soap line with the first batch she made in my class. They filled the house with warmth. The dining table, once heavy with unspoken tension, now looked alive again. Homemade breads, bright salads, the scent of thyme and lemon rising from the roast. Someone put on an old jazz record from Paul's collection, the needle crackling softly before the first notes found their way through the air. Leona, Cora said, raising her glass, "You've turned this place into something special." I smiled, setting down my fork. "It's not the place," I said. "It's the people who walk through the door." Mara laughed. "Well, I'm honored to be on the guest list." "That's the thing," I said, gesturing toward the porch. "The list's shorter now, but better." After dinner, as twilight deepened and the cicadas began their soft chorus, I led them outside. The porch light glowed faintly against the wood paneling, casting a circle of gold around a small brass plaque I'd installed earlier that afternoon. It read, "Home by invitation only." Joni's daughter read it aloud and grinned. "That's perfect," she said. Cora touched the plaque with her fingertips. "You had this made, had it engraved last month," I said. Figured it was time to make things clear. Not everyone who wants a place at your table should have one. There was a ripple of laughter, gentle knowing. They understood. Every woman there had her own story of giving too much of mistaking obligation for love. We lingered on the porch, long after dessert, the light above humming softly, moths circling in its warmth. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt earned. When the evening wound down, they insisted on helping with the dishes. Cora washed, while Mara dried Joni humming as she stacked clean plates beside the sink. Water splashed, laughter echoed, and for the first time in years the clinking of dishes didn't sound like penance, it sounded like belonging. As the last of them left, I stood on the porch, watching their taillights fade into the soft blue dark. The brass plaque caught the light just enough to glow faintly, a warm glimmer against the wood. I touched it once, tracing the engraved letters with the edge of my thumb. The air smelled of rain somewhere far away. Behind me, the house waited, quiet, steady, full. They said I was out. I whispered, half smiling. Maybe I was finally in. The porch light stayed on as I turned back inside its glow, spilling across the threshold like a promise kept. The morning light in early May was soft enough to feel merciful. Dew clung to the lavender buds outside the window, the air carrying that faint, sweet sharpness that only spring can make. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee, cooling beside a neat stack of papers, the final documents for the Hallberg Foundation for Women's Independence. The signature line waited at the bottom, crisp and empty. I took my time reading through each page again. Years of giving had taught me that money, once set loose, has a way of finding everything except what you meant it for. But this would be different. The foundation wasn't charity, it was structure. It would help women who wanted to rebuild, start over, begin again on their own terms. A different kind of inheritance. When I finally picked up the pen, my hand didn't tremble. I signed Leona M. Hallberg in black ink the way I used to sign contracts, except this time it felt like a release instead of an obligation. The papers went into a manila envelope addressed to the attorney in town. I sealed it, pressed the flap smooth, and set it beside the door for the afternoon mail. On the counter sat a small pile of birthday cards, plain, simple ones, with watercolor birds and wildflowers. One was for Grace, one for Eli. Inside each, I wrote just a few lines. I hope this year brings you something of your own to care for. No check, no gift card, just the words. I slipped the cards into envelopes, addressed them carefully, and placed them atop the outgoing mail. For the first time, it felt enough. Outside, the sun had climbed higher. I stepped into the garden, the hem of my housecoat brushing against the dew-soaked grass. The lavender had bloomed early this year, a soft violet haze spreading across the edge of the fence. I knelt, pressing my fingers gently into the soil, the scent rising up clean, earthy, forgiving. Paul used to tease me about that scent. "You're trying to turn this house into Provence," he'd said once, watching me tuck seedlings into the dirt. But on nights when he couldn't sleep, he'd walk the yard with me hand in hand, breathing in the same perfume of calm he pretended not to need. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering that his steady hand, the warmth that came without asking. The ache that followed was soft, now almost tender. I straightened and looked toward the porch. The brass plaque caught the sunlight, the words glinting clearly. Home by invitation only. It no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a promise kept to myself, to him, to the woman I'd finally become when the noise fell away. I stood for a while, letting the wind move through the garden through the years. Somewhere beyond the hills, life went on, Ariel finding her own footing, the twins growing into adults who might one day understand that boundaries weren't barriers, just gentle fences for the soul. "Love should multiply freedom," I murmured. "Not debt." The lavender swayed, brushing against my palm like an answer. I gathered a small handful and set them in the pocket of my apron, their scent following me back toward the house. My house where peace at last didn't feel like loss. It felt like ownership of breath, of time, of self. The door closed softly behind me as the morning light deepened, spilling across the brass plaque that gleamed in steady, quiet gold.